Hello and welcome back. Here we are with Chapter 13, Part B. We are going to do two important things in Chapter 13, Part B. We are going to learn about auxiliaries and phrasal verbs so that when you encounter them later in Chapters 3, 4, and 5, your brains don't actually explode. And we're going to provide a helpful resource for coming back later and reviewing this material. Believe me, you are going to want to do that. So we are going to use this chapter 13, Part B, as an opportunity to intro something and as a helpful review tool. As such, I'm not going to go into everything in as much depth as I will later. This is just a preview, just a taste, and just a helpful review tool. With all that said, let's dive in talking about auxiliary verbs. Yay, auxiliary verbs. So auxiliary verbs, in distinction to the kinds of verbs we've learned about just a little bit so far, transitive verbs, intransitive verbs, auxiliary verbs are helping verbs. We will learn a bit more about this in Chapter 4, believe you me, but they are going to include the forms of have and be, as well as the modal verbs can, will, shall, and may. There are also bonus modals like must and ought to, which don't take a tense, and the forms of do. So, for example, we can apply these auxiliary verbs to a regular old sentence like, I go to the store. We can include auxiliary verbs to say things like, I have gone to the store. This is have plus en, which will make sense after Chapter 4. I am going to the store. That's be plus ing. Again, stay tuned for Chapter 4. And we have our four primary modal auxiliaries, can, will, shall, and might. I can go to the store. I will go to the store. I shall go to the store. I might go to the store. As well as the stand-in auxiliaries, do, and the auxiliaries that don't take a tense, must and ought to. I do go to the store. Notice how emphatic that sounds. I must go to the store. I ought to go to the store. So these are auxiliary verbs. We are still going to diagram them on the main line. This will make more sense later. Turns out there are these things called marginal modals, also known as semi-auxiliaries. These are have to, be going to, used to, and be to. You can insert these also as auxiliary verbs. We have to buy gasoline. Our main verb is buy. Have to is our sort of semi-auxiliary. We are going to run out of gas if we don't. Run out of is a phrasal verb. More on that in a minute. We used to get better gas mileage. We are to get the car serviced next week. I recognize that be to as a modal is not something that we speakers of American English are going to be super familiar with. It's just a very British thing to say. We ought to get the car serviced. I went ahead and underlined the marginal modals and bolded the main verb. Just like with a regular modal from the previous slide, all of this verb information is going to go on the main line, so not that much to think about in terms of diagramming. Let's talk now about qualifiers. Qualifiers, these can add emphasis to adjectives or adverbs. They can appear in colloquial expressions. Qualifiers are words like very, quite, rather, really, fairly, to. They can apply to a lot of adjectives. Remember our friend, the adjective test frame? Very is the word standing in for all the other qualifiers in that test frame. We also have words like still, even, no, and much, which are going to apply to comparatives. And then we have sort of colloquial qualifiers, right nice, darn sure. There, right is being used as a qualifier. Another use for right, our very versatile word there. Sometimes ly adverbs can act as qualifiers of certain adjectives. This is a little tricky to keep in mind because then we're going to have a lot of ly situations, as in the diagram. So here, extremely, if I say Missy Franklin swims extremely quickly, or if Missy Franklin swims laps extremely quickly, notice that quickly is talking about how she swims, right? But extremely is talking about quickly. So when we diagram it, we're going to have that qualifier extremely modifying quickly rather than swims, and then the whole adverbial phrase modifies the verb. Let's talk now about another kind of verb, the phrasal verb. We're going to talk about this so much more when we get to chapter 3, but this will help us now to get thinking about the concept so then when it comes in chapter 3, we don't just lose our minds completely. Phrasal verbs are idiomatic verbs. They are formed by a verb and a preposition-like word called the particle. More on the particle coming up soon, and a whole lot more on phrasal verbs in chapter 3. Phrasal verbs have a different meaning than the sum of their parts. So if I gave you the example of, I put down Susie with a vicious comeback. Put down is my phrasal verb. You'll notice it has a different meaning than the sum of its parts. I didn't literally put Susie down somewhere. I don't think. Rather, I insulted her. So you'll notice that put down, the whole thing is functioning together as a phrasal verb. We have the verb, put, and down, which you would normally think of as a preposition or an adverb. Right? You can check to see if this is a phrasal verb by replacing it with another more precise verb. That's one way to check anyway, and I'll talk to you quite a bit about some other ways too in chapter 3. But if you can replace the whole thing with another more precise verb, then it's a phrasal verb. And it gives the whole sentence a different meaning, of course. I insulted Susie with a vicious comeback. Let's talk a little bit more about phrasal verbs and how they work. One thing that's fun about them, and by fun I mean one thing that's going to drive us absolutely crazy about them, is that they sometimes look indistinguishable from a verb and a preposition. So in our first example, example A, I'm going to pull through the drive-through window. Here, pull is a verb. Through is a preposition. And the drive-through window is the object of the preposition. But in example B, Tommy is going to pull through the operation. Notice it's the same exact combination of words. We are dealing with a phrasal verb. Pull is the verb and through is the particle. So it's not a verb and a preposition anymore. It's a phrasal verb. Verb plus particle. Pretty exciting. Again, we are going to have to think a lot about this and how to tell these things apart. Let's talk a little bit about prepositions, though, before we move on. Prepositions are going to help us understand this concept, too. Prepositions, as we will recall from talking about the closed classes, precede nouns or nominals. Prepositions can appear as a one-word or as a phrasal multi-word form. There is a big fat list on page 268 in our books. One great way to tell if it's a preposition or not is to check to see what follows it. If it is not followed by a nominal, it is not a preposition. That is pretty straightforward. If it's not followed by a nominal, a noun phrase of some kind, then it is not a preposition. Let's look at the preposition down for some ideas of how this works. My opinion of him went down. Well, check the word that follows down. Oh, there is none. It can't be a preposition. It has no object. In that case, down has got to be an adverb, right? It's telling us where our opinion of him went. What about in the expression, he talked down to me? You'll notice that down is followed by something, but it's followed by to me, which is not a nominal, but rather a verb phrase. Talk down, down is the particle in the phrasal verb. We walked down the beach. Aha! Here at last, down is a preposition. We can tell because it's followed by a nominal, the noun phrase, the beach. The beach is the object of the preposition down. Finally, let's talk just a scotch about this word I've been using this whole time, particle. When we have a phrasal verb, the second part of it, which we would normally think of as a preposition or maybe an adverb, is instead called the particle. So when a sentence ends with a preposition, frequently it's actually ending with a particle. It's part of a phrasal verb. So in the example, I want to sign up, up, which might at first sound like a preposition, is a particle. It's perfectly acceptable to end the sentence this way because it's not a preposition. It's a particle. So you can tell that to all your prescriptivist friends when they chide you. Let's run through a few more concepts quickly. Conjunctions. Chapter 10 talks about these at length. So I'm just going to summarize them briefly for you. There are 4 main categories of conjunctions: coordinating conjunctions, correlative conjunctions, conjunctive adverbs, and subordinating conjunctions. Coordinating conjunctions are the ones you're probably most familiar with. They have the fanboys acronym: for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. And these are joining items in any sentence slot. They're joining independent clauses also. I will talk to you much more about how they join items in sentence slots in Chapter 3. And I will talk much more about how they join independent clauses in Chapter 10. So just stay tuned. Those are our coordinating conjunctions. Let's talk about correlative conjunctions just a scotch also. These are like coordinating conjunctions in that they can connect both complete sentences and elements within a sentence. I bolded those because, haha, both and is a correlative conjunction. It's one of them. The others are neither, nor, either, or, and not only but also. That is all I have to tell you about them for now until we start to diagram them, so just stay tuned. Let's talk about conjunctive adverbs. Conjunctive adverbs join sentences just like other conjunctions, but they also have an adverbial emphasis. And like adverbs, but unlike conjunctions, they tend to be super movable in sentences. They can show us things like result, concession, apposition, much more on apposition coming up in Chapter 9, time, contrast. You'll notice I bolded the word rather. Remember, we also saw rather as a qualifier, but here it could serve as a conjunctive adverb. We would diagram it differently. That's exciting. Summary, reinforcement, these are all functions of conjunctive adverbs. Subordinating conjunctions are things that take clauses and make them into dependent or subordinate clauses. We are going to talk about this so much more in Chapters 7 and 8. Dependent clauses are very, very movable, and they're introduced by subordinating conjunctions, subordinators. Words that indicate time, words that indicate concession. I've bolded if because it's going to be coming back. It could show us contingency. If could show us condition, along with many other words. And if has one other gigantic function that we're not even talking about here. Reason, result, contrast, comparison. All of these words can function as subordinating conjunctions, which we will again see in Chapters 7 and 8 as part of our second midterm. Let's wrap up this conversation of the closed classes with something that sounds fun, but is actually not as fun as it sounds: expletives. Expletives are maybe not what you think. They are words that don't provide grammatical or structural meaning to the sentences. They just exist as placeholders to help us manipulate the rhythm of a sentence. The expletive there is a good example. For example, I would say, a fly is in my soup. Well, that's sort of a weird sentence. Let's say I wanted to manipulate it to add emphasis to the word fly, as in, there's a fly in my soup. I could add the expletive there at the beginning. This is different than the locative there to be discussed later. It can also function as an expletive when it stands in the subject. So for example, it's a beautiful morning. It technically is the subject of the sentence, but it's not referring to anything. It's empty. It is an expletive. We call expletives empty words. Boy, oh boy, did we just learn a lot about the closed classes. You can come back to this slideshow whenever you have questions about these types of words. Cassidy says, keep on working hard and you will have success with these challenging grammar concepts. See you next time.